response up a little bit after seeing Gennadi's slides, but most of it's the same. And I agree with Gennady on just about all points, except for the characterization or the construction of this concept of objectivity. I have a knee-jerk reaction to anytime anyone brings up paradoxes, because I think that they usually can be resolved if we're clear about what we're doing. In this case, we can be consistent if we avoid shifting observational frames. But I come from a non-realist perspective, and I agree with Gennadi's vision of emergent constructivism, which I'll show you in a minute. I mean, all of my work has proceeded from that, that point of view. So I think our disagreements are relatively trivial and about the concept of objectivity and perhaps realism. Generally speaking, my knee-jerk reaction is that paradoxes are caused by ambiguities of interpretation, and we can avoid them if we want. For example, in the foundations of mathematics, the Gödel undecidability theorems only apply if you have potentially infinite formal systems. If everything is finite, then there's no paradox of consistency. And likewise with the observer, if you stick to one observational frame, you don't have these paradoxes of Wigner's friend and where you're going to put the dividing line of the epistemic cuts and all that. So I think to be clear about this, we need to look at the operational structure of observers and the process of theory building. And there are different realms in those kinds of operations. And some of them allow for multi-perspectival and arbitrary choice and anything goes. And others in the realm of testing and proof are more contractive, they're selective. And you have to agree with what you're testing in order to do that. So I see measurement as an operational primitive. And we as observers can freely choose our observable, self-consciously or not. But once we've chosen those, if we want to engage with a community of observers, we have to operationally define what we're doing. We have to have replicable measurements and such that our models are intersubjectively verifiable. So I don't think that the role of the observer is problematic if one takes a non-realist operationalist view, and that this paradox is an artifact of realism in its conception of objectivity. And I have a slide where I try to map these things into the representationalist, non-representationalist debate that Gennady alludes to. I come from thinking about the operational structure of the observer. This is the Hertzian commutation diagram from Heinrich Hertz circa 1891, where an observer has a problem. They want to predict some set of observables from some other set of observables. And that's a free choice. They choose the observables, the measurements that they're going to make on some physical system. The first set of measurements consists of forms initial conditions for a formal algorithmic model that then makes a predicted result that then is compared with a second set of measurements. Now, I have been an experimental neuroscientist where we recorded from neurons and attempted to predict what the pitch would be that using a neural model, a neural computational signal processing model, to predict what pitches we should hear. And then you compare the pitches that are generated by the predictions to the observed results, say psychophysical data from human beings. And when the predicted results comport with the observed results, you have empirical adequacy. If they don't, then you have to go, the observer has to go back and either change the algorithm, the predictive algorithm, or change the observables. You know, it may be that what we were recording from in the neurons wasn't the right response variable. It might be that our model for how the brain uses that information is incorrect, and we have to adjust that. There's a there need not be, as Hertz pointed out, there need not be any correspondence between what's going on in the model and what's going on in the real world. That it's an operational criterion. Now, I developed a theory of percept action systems based on primitive operations of observers, and we can't go into this. We could go into it in the discussion. And there are various levels of self-construction and self-adjustment that observers can, are capable of. We have fixed systems of sensors and effectors, but if we change the computational part, like in a trainable machine, the observer can adjust basically their model, their predictive model, or we can have systems that create their own sensors and effectors. And that's basically like the Piagetian accommodation, changing the schema of the operating model. So it's possible to have a theory of constructivist theory of observers where new ideas are possible. You know, so if you have a fixed set of primitives, you can recombine those and get combinatoric creativity. Or if you have the ability to add new primitives, you can enlarge that set. But the set of new primitives is ill-defined, and so it's open-ended. And past electrochemical device is an example of that. So back to representationalism and anti-representationalism. I see this, so everyone agrees, and I agree with Gennady, everyone agrees that there's an external observer independent world that exists. The question is whether we have access to that, whether we have some sort of privileged access to that gives us access to objective reality and absolute truth. And there's the real dividing line between realists and constructivists. But there are also parts of the non-realist community that don't believe in models at all. And so I make some distinctions here. For the realists, science can access the objective structure of the world independent of observers and measurements. Truth is regarded as correspondence between the model and reality. Knowledge is true belief. Meaning is thought in terms of reference, aboutness, or representing the world as it is. And full true descriptions of the world are possible and attainable. I count myself in this camp where what you could call hard pragmatism or operationalism. You don't need the metaphysical concept of reality to do science. Science only partially accesses the forms of the material world, which are Kantian things in themselves, through measurements. But you can have intersubjective verification. You can arrange things, measurements, so that it doesn't depend on the beliefs of individual observers or what their position is. If you operationalize what you're doing sufficiently, you can get agreement about measurements and frames. And within that context, there can be objective tests and measurement. In this case, objective doesn't mean true vis-a-vis reality. It means independent of observer subjectivity. And in this view, it's a verificationist theory of truth. We can have analytical truths by virtue of proofs and demonstrations, empirical truths by virtue of measurements, and pragmatic truths by virtue of demonstrations of efficacy. So in the other camp, which there are parts of social science that adopt this and phenomenology, we toss the whole notion of testing out the window, that the criteria are different. You're not looking for these sorts of rigorous tests. You're looking more for explanatory consistency and usefulness. So in my view, models are used in different ways. And partly we're talking across purposes when we talk about models like an autopoiesis model of society, let's say, which is not predictive, and a model that we were attempting to make, in the neurophysiology of pitch, that is predictive. So there are predictive models that whose criteria is predictive efficacy. There are models that guide effective action, predict if you do this, this, and this, to build a bridge, you're going to get a bridge that holds this amount of weight. There are explanatory models where the criteria is explanatory coherence and intelligibility. And there are finally heuristic models where you're not even necessarily concerned with coherence. You just want a font of new variability, new ideas that then can be operated on. In this realm, fire ovens, anything goes holds. So one of the divisions between the hard sciences, so-called hard sciences, and the soft sciences are that the hard sciences have clear criteria for testing, whether it's empirical adequacy or proof, whereas the soft sciences are usually, because they're dealing with more complex problems, such as trying to understand social systems, they don't have models that can be tested or falsified in any clear way. And as Wolfgang Pauli would say, they're not even wrong. But not all models need to be falsifiable. That there are realms where we want explanatory models and heuristic models. But we should distinguish between those realms where we can test the models and those realms where we can't, such as the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is inherently untestable. So there's a general process of problem solving. We have a problem at hand. We define the problem, sharpen up what would constitute an adequate solution. We choose an observational frame or an action frame. What actions do we have available to us? What observables do we have to us? We choose then predictive algorithms that within that framework or schema, and then we evaluate the performance of the model. And if it gives us analytical consistency or empirical prediction or pragmatic efficacy, then we're done. We've solved the problem. If it doesn't, we have to go back and choose another predictive algorithm, or we have to go back even further and choose another frame. And those are free choices of observers. And there are not algorithms for choosing appropriate frames because the space of possible observation, measurements and actions is ill-defined. So it goes from fixing pragmatics to fixing semantics to fixing syntactics. And obviously we can also go backwards. And if we don't have a solution, we may even give up on the problem. So this is my last slide. In my view, there are three phases of adaptive self-organization. One is an expansive phase where you're creating variety, anything goes. There's brainstorming, serendipity, imagination, ambiguity, ill-defined open possibilities, creative, heuristic, and paradoxes are okay. And that's the inclusive phase where we keep all the ideas on the table. And in science, it's early hypothesis and theory formation. In mathematics, it's imagination, and engineering, it's an early design phase where all things are possible. And then we go to a refinement phase where we cull some of those possibilities. We make the thing internally consistent. We look to possible measurements and deciding what measurements we want, what kinds of frames we want, and considering the role of the observer in that phase. And then there's a contractive phase where we test the candidates using explicit, well-defined criteria that everyone agrees on. And there are no paradoxes or ambiguities, so you can't test anything. and that's an exclusive realm. So I agree with Gennady. We want our science to be open and inclusive, but it needs to be open in this expansive phase. And currently, if you look at the funding for science, there's not much that's they don't fund this phase. They only fund this contracted phase. So theory building, is not on the NIH platter, and neither is theory envisioning. But there are these general expansion contraction phases that we see also in biological evolution, where you have variation and then organismic stability, sort of a pretest for survival, and then natural selection. So I think all these thoughts regarding the embeddedness of observers, I don't want to discourage that, because I think that observers are embedded no matter what. Even if you're sticking an electrode into a neuron, the act of sticking the electrode into the neuron affects what the neuron does. But your consideration of those things is in these formative phases and not in the testing phase. I think if we can be clear about that, we can be clear about the realms where we can expect objectivity, meaning not independence of individual observers. So that would be my way of solving the paradox of observers within a non-realist but constructivist framework. I'm sorry if I went over, I don't know.
Jason, may I quickly respond and very briefly? Yeah. Okay, Peter, sometimes in our exchanges, I felt that you may somewhat misunderstood what I was trying to say earlier. I am not opposed to experiments. I welcome them, although I welcome them for a reason that probably is different from what you see, and I can explain it later. But let me go back to what you were saying on overcoming this influence of subjectivity and subjective biases. So here's how I reconstruct the process that you described, the production of knowledge. There is first expansive state and anything goes. Therefore, subjective choices reign supreme. Then there is a stage of theory formulation. And again, what I read in your in your descriptions is that the emphasis is in selecting which theories, theories that were articulated in this expansive anything goes stage. There will be some selection process, and this selection.
Not in the anything goes stage. That's pure generation of alternatives.
Yeah, there is from what I understood, and moreover, this selection will be based on predictive success, which is utilitarian and instrumental criterion. The choice based on these criteria can only be subjective. That's what is predictive, what will be predictably successful. Then there is engineering stage. Again, the emphasis is on commonalities and agreement, and therefore elimination of differences. These subjective choices eventually lead to selection of observable frames, observables, and tools of insight. My question is, at all of these stages, I see the presence of subjective choice. How do you get to objectivity? And you reinterpreted objectivity in different terms, in terms of reproducibility and independent of it. Let me illustrate this maybe with a good example. I think it's an experiment that Piaget did in his time. He took a three-dimensional model of a mountain, and he showed it to a group of children from one side, and he asked them to describe what they see. And the children provided a very good description. And then he asked them a question: how do you think this mountain looks on the other side? The answer was the same. They said the same. When he turned it around, they were genuinely surprised that it looked different. So my point is that if you specify the conditions, if you specify the angles at which you should see something, if you specify the instruments of your observation, you will get the results. These results will be real. But they will
they'll be agreeable. They'll be intersubjectively verifiable.
Intersubjectively, yes, anyone can observe it, but you will observe it from a very subjective angle, which makes me, of course, the partaking in your experiment. I don't see the other side. Of course, if you will give me the same time, the results are real, but they're not objective. They don't. And the criterion for objectivity is inclusion of differences, and that's the theme that I don't particularly see. Now, I wanted to make a few other points.
The problem is if different people, if different members of the observational community don't agree on the criteria for evaluating the model, then there's no agreement on how to test the model. And there's no objectivity per se.
I think there is an
observer has their own predictions and they have their own criteria.
I think if you construct a frame that includes all differences as particular cases. Now, I want to also.
Well, I don't know what that means because I don't think the space of differences is.
What it means is this. Look,
describable.
there is my perspective and there is your perspective. You emphasize my perspective includes your perspective. I include your perspective because I value empirical thing.
Yes.
Non-linear.
Mine includes yours because
not entirely. You don't talk about inclusion of differences. You don't talk about conservation. You don't talk. I mean,
well, in the expansive phase, everything goes. So you can have inclusion.
But that's only at one stage, and then there is a selection that comes from this stage. But let's say, I think the important difference is also this: consciousness, and that's what I want to emphasize. Knowledge. This is the most powerful level of organization of reality. It is most powerful because it regulates all other mental operations, but that is not all. It is the most powerful because it is capable of creating an infinite number of new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization. Conservation drives this process. If consciousness does not embrace and does not follow this process, it will not be able to evolve and thus conserve itself. What does not evolve will inevitably disintegrate. If the most powerful level of organization that sustains regulation disintegrates, the entire system will follow the path of disintegration. We have to recognize and remember that the source of the process of integration is conservation, and the roots of conservation are in the unique nature of our universe, not in some anthropocentric, utilitarian, or instrumental considerations. The benefits we derive from our capacity to create an infinite number of new and increasingly more powerful levels of organization are the benefits, the knowledge benefits, are mere byproducts. The main thing that the process does is conserves and preserves. That is its primary function. Now, I also wanted to address the paradoxes issue. You say in your points here that the result of ambiguities of interpretation. Gödel has demonstrated that any axiomatic system contains indemonstrable sentences.
Any axiomatic system capable of arithmetic on the natural numbers, and the natural numbers are.
I think he talked.
We are talking about formal systems that are potentially infinite, so they're not well defined.
I think our knowledge is infinite.
Formal systems to finite systems with finite string.
I hear you, Peter. I hear you.
There's no halting problem. There's no consistency problem.
I hear you, and I don't necessarily, I don't agree, but I hear you. These are sentences that are real, but cannot be justified on the basis of systems axioms. And
real only in a Platonic imaginary.
I understand that.
And Gödel was a Platonist, you know?
Now, in other words, any axiomatic system, and our knowledge is based on axiomatic systems, is ultimately inconsistent And inconsistency is a paradox. There are no ambiguities in the liar's paradox.
No. Nothing we ever compute is
Peter,
infinite.
let me finish.
Okay, gentlemen.
You will have a chance to respond.
Nothing that we ever
Peter, a strict
Lloyd
logical.
has raised the hand for a long time. Lloyd, let's listen to Lloyd. And then we have a Carl Goldberg just jumping in.
I have one more sentence. Jason, I have one more sentence. A strict logical analysis of the liar's paradox demonstrates that the liar is telling the truth when he lies and lies when he's telling the and tells the truth when he lies. The source of paradoxes is not ambiguities, but something much more fundamental in our thinking. That's all.
Lloyd,
I promise I will no longer have any other interjections.
Okay.
Well,
Lloyd,
I think, Gennady and I agree on a lot, most of what he says. We just don't agree on realism.
I'm realist. I agree.
Yes.
I agree with this with you on this.
We are in
I'm
agreement
a
on
realist.
that.
I agree that we disagree.
We disagree
And
on the
I can-
ontological stuff.
And I can explain why I believe, well, first of all, my basic sort of sense of it is, if I am real and if I'm aware of my autonomy, then I must be something autonomous from. What is it that I'm if I, as Marx was saying, if you grant yourself existence, you must grant existence to what's outside of you. Otherwise, deny your own self. And I cannot deny my own self empirically.
Well, as you say in your paper, and I agree, anti-realists and realists agree that on the existence of a realm that's outside the observer and independent of the observer. Where we disagree is about knowledge of that realm beyond our measuring devices.
I can prove that realist view in this regard. In other words, the Kantian issue can be dismissed. And the reason why it can be dismissed is precisely because of the power of our capacity to create new levels of organization. We can create an infinite number, and that will allow us to identify many properties. The things we deal with in this world are finite things. Finite things have finite number of properties. Therefore, somewhere along the line, and that's why I indicated that my approach promises a possibility of fully objective knowledge, but doesn't guarantee. We have to move along this path. We have to create new levels of organization, identify new properties, set new experiments. But eventually, adding new properties does not explain anything about a particular finite object. It becomes final explanation. Adding new levels of organization does not add anything to the interpretation and understanding of this particular object. Of course, if we talk in the cosmic scale, then we change. The universe, our consciousness is doing all these wonderful things, and we direct our actions. We eventually start, flying to other planets, populating, and so on. We change the universe. We can do that, but that in that sense, it may be that actually, ironically, may be the only actual proof of the fact that our universe is infinite, because we can create an infinite number of levels of organization, infinite possibilities. Now, finite objects have finite.
Instead of the word infinite, I would say indefinite. I would say ill-defined. So it's open because it's ill-defined, not because it's infinitely extensible.
Yeah, it's open, but it's, as far as, for example, analysis of finite objects, let's say Earth or Sun or whatever, that these are finite objects with finite number of properties. Eventually, maybe not today, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. Eventually, we will exhaust the number of properties that are pertaining to a particular object, and we'll have a description and use of it. Until then, but what's interesting is that the process of creation that I emphasize, it does not keep it closed. As you know, it does not keep it closed. we welcome, it says that whenever new difference appears, I'm committed by the process of creation to include it and create a frame that would include my current position and this difference as its particular cases, which the result of which will be richer structure of seeing more possibilities, making us more, it's a form of empowerment. It's a form of empowerment. And that's what I seek in this process, empowerment in terms of knowledge and everything else. So, so that's my answer to this.
Lloyd, you raised your hand before?
Oh, no, I still want to make a point. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. It was very interesting to listen to. Both positions, I'm sympathetic to Peter's liberalism. I'm also sympathetic to Cariani's evolutionary vision. I think my comment address Cariani's contribution first. If I listen to it, I hear two chapters. There's first the part which is derived from Piaget and which raises the question of objectivity and the observer and how it is different from a transcendental subject. And then there's a programmatic part which follows from that. I think there's a problem in the first part, at least from my perspective. I would say objectivity is deeply embedded with intersubjectivity, and Peter makes that point too. To the extent that I would say that the whole idea that science is created by observers and not by observational reports and not in communication structures makes the whole, and then Piaget steps in. I think even Freud has that broader, that it is a communicative structure. Parsons has that too. And that there is not a single, that is not the individual which is evolving, but it is a scientific revolution which is going on continuously. Not necessarily at the individual level. Of course, the individual has to straighten it out. The individual has to solve a puzzle. Most of that puzzle is solved by, let's say, the age of 4. But science begins only at the age of 18. Or maybe somewhat earlier, but not straightforward from the age of 4. So the Piaget story is helpful as an analogy, but I would say it is not addressing the core issue that the scientific enterprise as we now know it is a social affair which requires the development of discursive knowledge, which is of a different nature as the previous type of knowledge, which is already there from the, so let me say it differently. It's not us evolving. When we meet Julius Caesar, we can perfectly understand him. We can read his book, De Bello Gallico. No problem at all. There's no evolution at the individual level. There's an evolution going on at the super individual level, and we have begun to address that. Taking it as you do it as a kind of observer, I see it as a remnant of the transcendental subject, which has now been materialized as an observer.
I don't think this really contradicts Piaget. Piaget looked at the limited segment, yes. But let's think about it. In evolutionary terms, humans at some point developed capacity to have mental images. Conservation of mental images required, again, combining and so forth. That was the role of society. They developed language that allowed them to externalize their internal mental images. And they did it incrementally until they developed a language that was more or less not totally transparent, but more or less understandable within the same linguistic domain. So Piaget and Vygotsky are not really that far apart. Simply Piaget did not look at the social aspect and Vygotsky did. But, I think it follows. conservation, by the way, in my writings, I emphasize that conservation goes inside the individual, but it also goes outside. What we're doing now, what this interaction that takes place, is a form of conservation, because we're tying our knowledge to each other. And I will remember what Peter said and you, Loet, said, and I will not try to dismiss. I will not try to say Peter's wrong, Loet is wrong, and I'm right. I will try to construct, because each of you represent a particular view of reality. It is a result of your intense thinking. I cannot dismiss it. I have to take it into account if I want to enrich myself and you by creating a common frame. That's why I'm focusing on this. So Piaget did not talk much, although I think he talked somewhere about social aspects. Actually, he looked at the way kids were playing games in Geneva or something. You know, remember the moral judgment of children? I think that looks precisely at this aspect of, you know, sort of intersubjective form of creation, conservation, and creation. And it's a book, I have a reference to it. So I don't think there is, I think your points are valid and important, and you know, I should have probably mentioned the social side in my presentation, but I couldn't talk about everything. But I don't think there is much disagreement there. I don't think there's any disagreement at all. Social process is an important form for conserving and preserving our civilization.
It's not only contextual, it is and Peter makes that point, that there's a distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. Popper's formulation, but you can also take other formulations, and yours is primarily oriented towards context of discovery, and context of justification is AP. It remains next to it. It's not a central process in the shaping of science. Well, for example, if you look at children playing, they're not developing a context of discovery and a context of justification. They're not making that type of distinctions. Okay, I made my point.
Jamie raised your hand.
Oh, can I
Yes,
just
go ahead.
I have some comments.
So all animals have feedback mechanisms. You know, I developed a theory of percept action systems and reward systems that then cause internal reorganization in the brain to facilitate behaviors that are rewarding versus behaviors that are punishing, and avoiding behaviors that are punishing. So in a sense, in every animal, even, you know, while children are playing, they're bumping into things. They have, you know, whether they're internal models of the world and what's going on, those get changed by their actions and the outcomes of their actions, you know, vis-a-vis hedonic drives and avoidances. So there are ways of thinking about that, even if you don't consciously distinguish between, you know, a realm of observation and or discovery or testing. There are those mechanisms that are built in, they're feedback mechanisms that are built into the regulation of behavior.
May I raise my question, or?
Go ahead. You raised hands for a long time.
Yes. It is a comment, I think, and a question that actually gives credence to everything that Peter said. So, Glenady, I heard you talk about difference, but I didn't hear you say anything about distinctions, the making of distinctions. And when you brought up Piaget, there was another child psychologist in Vienna that is, I didn't hear you mention at all, and that is the Bühlers, Charlotte Bühler and Karl Bühler. And they developed a theory of imageless thinking, in which they focus more on gestalts. And a gestalt can be set up as a collection of distinctions and displaying with distinctions. So it kind of gives more, it makes more concrete this idea of making distinctions. You make distinctions one way, you make distinctions another way. So you create one type of difference, and then you create another type of difference. And so the whole complexity of the observer and the questions that it generated is actually the distinction between the observer, the observable, and the unobservable. And so now to be concrete in my feedback, I think that Peter was giving us a model of thinking that really highlights the importance of distinctions. And I think, Gennady, that is the thing that will make your model stronger if you're more explicit about the distinctions. Because it's only when we work with distinctions that we can talk about difference. And dus with respect to the comment about Gödel, that was really beautiful to see the difference between your two viewpoints. Peter is talking about the formal language, a formal, artificially created language that is either Platonic or something else, while you're talking about something else. So I hear you both because I'm making distinctions. And I'm trying to keep track of them.
Well,
So that's my question. Yeah.
Margareta, I frankly, I don't see difference between distinction and difference, but I will think about it. I will take your remark as it requires my reflection. I have to form my opinion. What is the difference between distinction and difference? In my head, it's basically the same thing. You know, one sees it differently. So I'll have to think and read more about it. I will Google obviously what you're saying and try to form my informed opinion on this. But seems like you're making a point that I did not think about. So I have nothing to add to it. As far as what goes on between Peter and me, apart from disagreements, actually, I think both are complementary more than disagreeing. I think I agree with Peter on this one. The complementary, he looks at one side that I also look at, but at this point, I think that this general philosophical understanding of the importance of the processes that contribute to our knowledge, that our knowledge is not simply about our knowledge, it's about much bigger thing, conservation. This is what we have to worry about in this world today. So I think it's more complementary. I have read Peter's articles and review of the volumes that he did for Constructivist Journal a while ago, I think in 2012, found it very illuminating in many ways. And these are not the issues I focus on now, but I will keep on doing it. I mean, I'm a limited man.
We're open, but limited, but open. Can I just want to reference two works that were influential in my thinking. The one is the Piaget versus Chomsky, Language and Learning. There was a book edited by Massimo Piatelli Palmerini.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know that.
That I'm sure Gennady also was influenced by. Another is Maruyama's concept of deviation amplifying systems. In other words, systems that provide variety and operate on the differences and generate a variety of points of view rather than simply preserving what points of view there are. So I just want to get those out.
I think circulating various pieces that you think are relevant would be useful for all of us. And I can circulate my pieces and what I think is relevant. I focused on Piaget, but there are others that I looked since then and many more. So I think it would be useful that this will, of course, I can go back to this presentation and see what, pick up the references, but I think sending it around would be very good.
Can I ask a quick
Yes.
question? What is conserved in your system, Cariani? What is conserved? If you say conservation is so important.
I'm on top.
Huh?
Oh, you didn't hear it? I asked, what is conserved in your system? You were saying is this conservation is so central. What is then conserved?
Why conservation is so central?
No, what is conserved?
What is
By
what?
that you say
What is it? Yeah, ontology. What is it?
What, conservation?
No, what
What is
the
conserved
matter?
in the,
The stuff
what
being
is conserved in the
conserved.
conservation?
What is?
No, he doesn't get it.
I don't think my audio is very good, but
Can you please answer the question, what is, if you say it is conservation, what is then conserved in that conservation?
I did not get the second word. What is what in conservation?
Вы консервируете.
It's not conserved.
What is being conserved?
Yes.
Conserved. You're talking about a conservation versus creation, and the Lord is asking you, what is that stuff that you conserve? What's the content there?
What is the stuff that is conserved?
Exactly.
Actions from atoms, from particles. You know, when particles combine into atoms, they acquire a much greater degree of freedom. They are exercised more often, and as a result, they're conserved better. Action is conserved. Our universe is about action, and action is conserved. When children combine their sensory motor schemata, they don't have any purpose for it except one. Exercise it as much as possible. The more you exercise it, the better. It gives them pleasure. The pleasure principle when a child sees the face of the mother, familiar face, the familiar schema comes into play and the child gets enjoyment. The pleasure principle, aesthetic principle is very much connected to it. People experience pleasure in exercising their schemes. And because exercising their schemes conserves them. And in order to conserve them more often, they connect them to other schemes so that they would be exercised more often. And the more often they exercise, the better they are conserved. That's the whole connection from conservation to inclusion of differences and so on. That's what is being conserved. Atoms are conserved by being aggregated into huge clouds, and then within these clouds, they develop new structures, they develop new differentiation, they create galaxies and stars and blah, blah, blah. You know, all of these things. It is an infinite process of creating more powerful, because that's the only way to conserve. A system that does not evolve begins to disintegrate. Why? Because its regulatory level is not conserved. You need to conserve the system's regulatory level. And every system has regulation. Otherwise, it cannot exist without regulation. Regulatory level has to be conserved. In order to conserve the regulatory level, this new level of organization must arise so that it would conserve the regulatory level and so on. And this is, as in that joke, and then the turtles all the way. Remember this joke about the Eastern sage? I don't. Anyway, doesn't matter. And then that's why we, let me put it this way. There is a famous statement about gee, my head is cracking. Entropy, right?
Yeah.
That the world will eventually come to even distribution of, there will be no more free energy and we'll die. That, in my view, is not going to happen. Why? Because we constantly create new levels of organization that give access to new resources. It's the devil of what's his name? Maxwell. So Maxwell's devil. Yes, the production of entropy cannot go below zero, but there is nothing in the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that prohibits it to stay at zero. That's what we are doomed to. We are doomed to constantly innovate and maintain the level of production of entropy at zero. If we go below zero, if we go to higher than zero, then we cannot go below zero. But we can go higher than zero. Then we have the problem of environment, we have the problem of political stability, we have the problem of knowledge production, we have a lot of problems. That's why we are condemned to do it. That's why I'm so passionate about it, because I really feel that the problems we face today is really a result of the practice of exclusion, both in politics and society and in science.
Can you bring my pocketbook? Sorry, excuse
Huh?
me. Apologies.
Klaus, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, and there's so much to be said, and I hate to be so short, but differences and distinctions. There are no differences without someone making a distinction or something making a distinction, whether it's a measurement or whether it's perception or an observation. So differences, when you focus on differences, you deny actually the agency that makes them. That's one point. The other one is the issue of paradox. I think paradoxes don't exist except in a logic. There must be a logic in which it is impossible to reconcile something that is and something at the same time that is not. So the logic, where does it come from? It doesn't come from the outside world. It comes from the observation or the observer who is fixated on one logic and finds that it doesn't work out. So that is, I think, a property of the observer and not a property of the objectivity outside. That we talk so much about universe. Universe is just an abstract creation of observers that think there is only one kind of thing in the world, and that has something to do with religion originally. The point is actually that when you think of cybernetics, about the a purposive system that creates actually their own world within it. And that is also true for observers. They create their own world, or children, they create their own world, but then they start talking to others, and there comes a balance, agreement, etc., etc. That is the social phenomena. The point is that the universe doesn't exist. Now, the issue of reality, is reality exists? I hear all the time that we are real. I don't know what that means. Actually, for me, the observer makes certain kind of imposes certain kind of conceptions, acts on it, and the reality becomes only evidence by saying, no, you can't do that. This is a constraint. Reality is a constraint that opposes, if you want, your own the observer's constructions. And we are indeed free to make all kinds of things when we don't, particularly when we don't test it. So I think there are so many problems that I see are not addressed and or confused, including now, for example, objectivity. What is objective? Well, objective is when you agree that there is no difference, and so I mean we make that too simple. Most of these concepts are too abstract and not very well thought through as of how they come about.
Well,
Gary, want to say something?
Klaus, all I can say is we can explain better. Real is what exists independently of our mind.
Yeah, but we don't know that.
Huh?
You have never seen it.
You have never seen it?
Well, we have never seen it without seeing.
Well, I know, but
So then
well,
forget about
if
it.
a brick hits me on the head, I think I will also feel it. But let's leave that aside. That I'm just giving you my opinion.
I know.
Objectivity has several interpretations and several possibilities. I interpret it as all-inclusiveness. That is, viewing an object from all points of view. That's, to me, is objectivity. You're talking about objectivity as something being objectified, turned into external reality. I accept that. I am all for for experiments and practical. You see, our thinking originates in practical activity. Therefore, our thinking can be translated back into practical activity, into experiments, into production, into industry and whatnot. So that's where I agree with Peter totally, but this is necessary not only to prove objectivity, it is necessary to conserve the entire system, because practical level of interactions, practical level is part of the system. We cannot simply go into our empiries and in a refined atmosphere of mental thoughts. It has to dig its heel into real world of machines, of instruments, to conserve it, to conserve the entire system, because our thinking is the top level of this matryoshka style in levels of organization. They're nested in each other. So it's necessary, and I agree with you, it's necessary to objectify these things. A theory that is not placed into practice is damaging, not only because we want the experiment, but it is damaging, first of all, because it does not strengthen the system itself. We have to do it. So there is just no choice to it. So with practical experiments, industry, social organization, all this becomes important.
Gary?
Yes.
Well, practical experience, I fully agree with that, but it is
Okay.
limited as to what you can practice. And that's the reason why I think one should confine oneself to what one can experience through practice, and not just going far beyond that. Now, you can, of course, do that, and this is what tradition of science is already, the whole construction of a universe. I think this is an ancient discussion, conception, which has creeped into the universities and physics, etc., but it is not there. It depends on how you act on it.
Yes, of course, of course. There's no question.
Then forget about universe. Let's talk about multiverses.
Wait a second. What does universe and multiverse have in common? The multiverse is an idea, not proven. Besides, this idea.
So is the universe not proven.
Let me explain. What this idea tells me is that all these multiverses are in no way connected or have any effect on my universe. So for all practical purposes, I am, as an empirical limited human being, I'm dealing with my universe. Forget. And besides, if there are multiverses, I grant you that, they exist in some space. What is this space if not the universe of all multiverses? So I think we're getting into some kind of a cyclical
Theological issues.
Yeah, logical issues. I think
Theological issues.
Exactly. I don't think we need to go there. I accept your thesis about practicality. All of this should be practically. We don't have to talk about. I simply brought up the universe as an attempt to explain where is this conservation comes from. Why is it so pervasive? That's what my purpose was, to show that this is really important.
Because you made it metaphysical. Of course, you made it metaphysical.
Yeah.
Therefore, it is so pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
You did it yourself.
I didn't get it.
You made it metaphysical. The whole storyline, after you finished with Piaget, You set up a metaphysical program, and then you say why it's so pervasive, because you defined it as pervasive.
Look, I would not really dwell on it too much. I mean, this was not brought in as a proof of anything. It was brought as an aside, as sort of explanatory. You don't want to look at it, don't look at it. Let's drop it. Conservation plays an important role in what children do in the emergence and the evolution of our consciousness, of our knowledge, and so forth. That's all that's enough for me. Where it comes from, let's leave it closed. Let's say it comes from God.
Let's say it is, let's confront it with creative destruction, which is very important for technological development. That's not conservation, it's change.
I don't know. I have to think about it. Send me your what you think, and maybe references. I will think about it. I can't, after over an hour of talking, I'm a little
okay.
more confused in my head. But if you send it, I will respond. And I see conservation as important. Okay. I think the ubiquity of conservation how many laws of conservation do you know? Conservation of momentum, conservation of energy, conservation of movement, conservation of this. I mean, everything is conserved. If you talk to any of the scientists, they all talk about conservation.
You can also use dissipation.
By the way, I wrote a piece entitled, it's sort of also experimental piece, and I like experiments because they keep me alive, about the revising the cosmic story, where I try to trace the same model through the evolution of the universe, and in fairly scientific, dealing with quantum things and non-quantum with gravity and this and that. So it may not be very convincing. It may be more philosophical than hard science, but I think philosophy and general considerations are important. Einstein was pointing to this, is that science without philosophy is not. I think he had a point. It sort of guides our research. So I think it's important. I also wrote an article that was published on revising the Darwinian model. It's entitled Conservation, Creation, and Evolution, Revising the Darwinian Model. Was published by, I can send you a reference.
Gennady, let me assure you that I appreciate what you're doing. But,
what was that?
Let me assure you that I appreciate what you are saying.
Okay.
And the only thing is, if you replace the whole idea of conservation with dissipation, you get a completely different story.
No, I didn't replace it. Dissipation is. I did not replace. I talked about. I talked about entropy. I talk about entropy, but I also talk about Maxwell's demon. I talk that we, with our ingenuity, can construct new levels of organization that give access to new resources. We can hold entropy at bay. We can constrain it. We cannot eliminate it. Dissipation will, and actually depends. I mean, the process of creation, by the way, depends on dissipation, depends on entropy. Entropy is a vital part of it, very vital. So dissipation is perfectly fine. And all we need to do is to construct new levels that give us access to new energy sources, to new possibilities, to new resources. We can keep it at bay. We can keep entropy. There's nothing in the second law of thermodynamics that prohibits entropy to stay at zero. And that, I think, is a very important either difference or distinction. You can judge it yourself, but that there's nothing in this law that can, and Maxwell pointed to this. He said, if we have a machine that directs molecules to go in the orderly way, and actually what I showed also in my presentation, which is very important, equilibration is a form of dissipation, and equilibration produces disequilibrium. So that's what I'm basing the argument, that dissipation leads to new forms, new possibilities, and new sources. We can conserve. That's where conservation is. That's why I don't think there will be thermal death. I don't think there will be thermal death.
Thank you for this all.
Yeah.
Well, are we not confusing physics with social phenomena? Indeed, any purposive system that has feedback is anti-entropic, but it is limited to the universe in which it operates, and it is not talking about the rest. So I think we generalize beyond these boundaries, and there is a great difference between the creation of alternatives and, let's say, physics, what happens with atoms.
What happens in Athens?
Atoms.
Carl, if I understand you correctly, you bring up the distinction with social processes. Is that?
Distinctions are made by something, by someone or something, like an instrument that makes distinctions between different temperatures. It's made by someone. The temperatures don't exist until you have something that makes the distinctions, and then it becomes real.
Well,
but this is a minor point.
Yeah, I think so. Again, my general principle is all differences, all distinctions should be integrated for the purpose of conservation and creation of new and more powerful level of organization. And it should be integrated by inclusion of differences, and it conserves them as particular cases. That is, cases, and we have to explain this, that cases that are true under specific conditions or assumptions. There are specific conditions and assumptions that make Euclidean geometry correct. And there are specific cases and assumptions that make non-Euclidean geometry correct. But non-Euclidean geometry, in my view, is better than Euclidean. It's more inclusive. Curvature equals to 0, and you end up with all the proper Euclidean theorems that are working. You don't have to deny Euclid. You don't have to throw him. He is conserved. You build a house, you do it. You know, use Euclidean geometry. You build a Verrazano bridge, think of something else. So curvature has but it's more, that's what I'm talking about, being more inclusive. The non-Euclidean geometry is more inclusive. It's broader. It offers us more possibilities. That's the point. More possibilities, more power.
In a sense, it's transcendent in that it incorporates the other systems or frameworks.
Could I interject a comment or two here?
Yes, we've been waiting for you.
Okay. Number one, I'm just very, very pleased to be able to listen to these two fine presentations. They both are well organized and well conceptualized, and both of them contain threads of logic. So my own comment distinguishes between the two threads of logic as it relates to mathematics and the sciences. And if you want, you can throw in philosophy too. I don't care about that part of it. So the first point, I think, is with regard to Gennadi's notion of the combination of A and B. Now, A and B here are symbols in the, I suppose, in the Aristotelian sense, and not in the sense of variables. So this notion of A and B combining, he gives 4 possibilities, which he lists on his chart. I only deal with the 4th one, not A and not B. Now, in the natural sciences, the notion of A and B could be 2 atoms, 2 different atoms, such that when you combine A and B, you get not A and not B. Rather, you get something new. You create something new emerges, like combine sodium and chlorine, you get sodium chloride. You've now changed the semantics of the logic, okay? You're no longer working with the same set of symbols that you did with symbolic logic at the beginning. You've moved from atomic sentences to molecular sentences and the new semantics of the molecular sentences. Now, this choice of just combining two formal symbols representing chemical elements can be expanded out indefinitely so that you can create as many new symbols as you wish. All of them will be outside the original symbolization of the chemical table of elements. This is the grounding for the notion of emergence. This is the grounding for the notion of Desjardins' notion of omega point, for example. This is the grounding of a different semantics that differs from the semantics of physics. And this is the end of that particular point that I wish to make there, that this notion of not A and not B, actually not A and not B imply C, where C is a creative object. And so this is the objectivity of the chemical or the natural sciences. Secondly, with regard to Peter's point, his mathematics, I think, he's published a very well-known paper in mathematics and the notion of constructivism as it relates to the, how would I put it, relates to the infinite. This notion is somewhat different from the notion of how one creates combinations within symbolic logic. And this notion of symbolic logic, as in the first example, falls within Gödel's theorem, where it is not applicable. So I agree with Peter's notion of Gödel's theorem only applies to the mathematically infinite as defined in terms of geometry. It does not apply to discrete systems such as one has from the atomic numbers.
First of all, I want to say this, that A and B is not A and B, it's a multiplication of A and B. It is, you're absolutely right. It is a new entity within which A and B are conserved, but this is a new entity. Indeed, mental images are neither olfactory and not video or audio or visual. It's both at the same time. It's a new entity. It combines.
Exactly. That's why water is different from hydrogen and oxygen.
I know that, so is mental images are different from all these operations. That's not the point. Oh God. I don't deny that. It's a totally different, it's a totally different entity, but it is, let me put it this way, life is different from non-life, but non-life is conserved in life. All these all these particles and quanta, they exist within the domain of life. They're not disappearing, they're there, they're conserved. So that's the whole point. As far as my logic, let
me finish, Gennady. I have published a couple papers one on the perplex number system, which uses the atomic numbers as the basis for the natural sciences. You can find that online. Secondly, I've published a second paper. The first one is in a mathematics journal, by the way. The second one is in Journal of Information Theory and deals with the information content of atomic numbers. And you can find that online too. So I agree with almost everything you said, Gennady. I'm just pointing out how this particular slide relates to the science of chemistry.
Listen, I'm not a logician, I'm not a mathematician. I'm more closer to philosophy than anything else. I used it simply as illustration. And don't make a big point out of this. You can use A and B as particular like you can say A is audio and B is visual. That's my line. I'm actually very much to actual actions. It's not logic. It's logic on. I only show that as a result of their multiplication, and this is not addition, Because, for example, the problem of inclusion is being raised in our contemporary social context by Democrats. But they think about inclusion as aggregation, as pluralism of different points of view. They don't talk about integration, and I think it's a wrong approach. It's not a true inclusion. That's why social conflicts continue, because we did not really integrate them. And that is a problem. So all I pointed to indicate is that there is an operation involved here, which is multiplication. Each property of each entity is multiplied by the properties of another. That they create a very powerful network of neurons do it. Neurons do it. They create very powerful network, and that's new. That's new. That's all I was trying to say, that there are more possibilities in A multiplied by B than either in A or in B separately. More possibilities. And when we have more possibilities, we see more differences, we see more observables, we identify better experiments. You know, we have greater degree of freedom. That's all
I understand what you're saying, and the degrees of freedom is perfectly reasonable. But let me point out further to your relationship between your statements about multiplication and Peter's notion of representation and anti-representation. All right. When you take two atomic numbers and add them together, you add the integers. So such as hydrogen is 1 and oxygen is 8. So you add the integers together and you get 10. All right. And at the same time, hydrogen has positive and negative charges on the nucleus and the electrons. Oxygen has negative and positive charges, a positive charge, excuse me. And when you combine these two, then you must multiply them from the electrical side of things. Now, this duality of needing both addition and multiplication to define or to describe water as a new entity, or the combination of them, is precisely what I was referring to when I said Aristotelian variables. You're using the concept of Aristotelian variables as being very broad general concepts and not in the precise mathematical sense that Peter was alluding to.
Well, I'll have to look closer at Peter.
I suggest you look very carefully at this argument, very carefully.
Well, all I can say is that when hydrogen and oxygen combine into a molecule, and molecules of hydrogen create water, there is a different mode of regulation that their relationship is. Before they are connected, they don't have in order to create a common level of regulation, they have to combine their properties.
Exactly, and that's exactly what the notion of the perplex number system is, that you must have a change in properties when you combine two perplex numbers.
I agree. There's nothing here that I find to be in disagreement. I agree. It's a different property.
Wow, I'm impressed.
My A and B is also makes this point. It's different properties, more. That's all I'm making. I don't know.
Let me
Maybe
just also.
Maybe I'm just tired.
Let me hopefully, undo some confusion. There's a difference between combining A and B in the sense of combinatorics and combining A and B like between two atoms. Some of them cannot be combined. Exactly. There is the issue of the relationship that can be used, and that is not part of the combinatorics. And so one has to see that's an issue of systems that can combine certain kind of things into larger entities, whereas combinatorics simply says, okay, we can put them together. Multiplication is just one system of making connections.
Klaus, I agree with you in the semantics that you're using of the notion of the definition of combinatorics.
Yeah.
However, if you want to go to the symbolic logic of the natural sciences, then you must invoke an obligatory logic. And an obligatory logic controls, or should we say, yeah, controls and regulates the need to have a conservation of the symbols that you use on the two sides of the implication. So combinatorics is a very broad, wide subject, and it takes a very special form of combinatorics to apply to the natural sciences. And that's an
It has to do
obligatory
with the
logic.
relationship between the elements that are combined, right?
Well, right, you have to create new relations between the
Yeah, that's right.
the elements.
But not all relationships can be used for all kinds of elements.
Exactly, exactly. There's a selectivity there.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why just combining things, it doesn't mean necessarily an increase of something.
Exactly.
There
In
has
fact,
to
it
be,
may
there
mean
has
a
to be a
decrease of
relationship
something.
between them.
You know, multiplication is different from addition, and that's fact. Now,
Yeah,
Klaus,
two
I have
different
you brought an interesting point that combinations are possible within the same level of organization. For example, sensory motor operations operate with neurons and physical, but they're controlled by neurons. If they were not controlled by neurons, their integration would not be possible. So you're right in that not everything goes with everything else, although in my, and this really getting a little far from the subject. For example, when you combine and you create a regulatory level of organization that is more powerful than the level of local interactions, you create a system which is hierarchical. But in order to be conserved, this system has to be equilibrated. In other words, the level of lower power has to be integrated with the level of higher power. That's the only integration between different levels of organization that is possible. So you're right, you cannot combine apples with machines or something, you know, other than, but yeah, that's a good you know, that's a good remark. It pushed me in that direction. I didn't cover it. Yeah.
Here I would return back to Peter's point of view, but now not from merely a syntactical point. And it seemed to me his entire presentation was syntactical in its nature, which is, I think, good science in that concept. But when you deal with if you deal starting with the chemical table of elements or atoms, and you want to combine atoms as entities into molecules, you now must change the logic of the sentences. Atomic sentences have to be transformed or transduced into molecular sentences. But now the language of molecules is a new language. And it's a new language that is based solely on the language involved with the physics of the chemical table of elements. So this is an emergent language. And
Yes.
the same way, the terms that emerge when you start talking about cellular biology, you now have another new language. A new language, the semantics is radically different from the semantics of molecular biology, for example. So you have to, when you're going to combine things, and as the number of objects you combined increases, you have to increase correspondingly the number of relationships. And as the number of relationships increase, the complexity of the languages increase. And you have to include new semantics to accommodate the new relations that exist between parts of the whole.
Peter, do you want to do some concluding remarks? But several of us need to go now. So
Well, I have no disagreement with Jerry. I agree. The process remains the same, but semantics changes and symbols change and all of this. So I don't have properties change, but I don't have any disagreement with that. Certainly mental images are different from sensory motor operations, even though they carry some of their properties, but it's a totally different ballgame. Absolutely.
There is a problem in neuroscience and psychology about how new concepts arise. You know, Piaget laid out a framework whereby you could have new concepts that get constructed. And we assume that new concepts arise by, or new categories arise by the training up of neural assemblies in the brain.
Yes.
And there are various people thinking about semantic pointers and trying to make convolutional operations that then, from the constituent features of the category, that make a new marker that denotes the category itself and how that might work. So we can come up with new kinds of categories. When we learn the sounds of our native language, you know, the phonetic categories, we train up neural assemblies to recognize and distinguish those categories, right? And then presumably there's some other marker for that concept that then can be operated on as a concept on another level. So there are problems in terms of how do you have this so this combinatorial creativity, and then there's creation of new categories, and how does that work within the brain? Anyway, that's an open-ended question. And the last thing is I've enjoyed this immensely, and thanks to all of you for this discussion.
I have too. I have enjoyed it. I think, and again, my request is to all of you, if you think that there's anything relevant to what we discussed, and I noted Jerry's name and his publications, and so I will look at those. And please, if you have anything to offer, please do it. Be a good citizen. Work for the survival of our civilization. I think we're running out of time and out of energy.